The gate had been latched for 5 years, 2 months, and 11 days, and Marcella Alden knew that number the way she knew the lines on her own hands without thinking, without trying, the way grief becomes the very architecture of a person's days. It was the autumn of 1882 in the high desert country outside of Tucson, Arizona territory, where the scrub oak turned rust-colored along the ridgelines, and the nights came down cold and sharp as a blade even when the afternoon still burned. The Alden homestead sat on a stretch of land that Marcella's late husband, Thomas, had staked 11 years prior, when the two of them had been young enough and foolish enough to believe that love and hard work were all a person needed to tame 40 acres of sun-baked earth. They had not been entirely wrong, as it turned out. The land had yielded corn and sorghum, and enough kitchen garden produce to keep them in provisions through the lean seasons. Thomas had built the house with his own hands, a low adobe structure with thick walls that breathed cool in summer and held heat in winter, and he had built the fence that ringed the property, a post-Andreal affair that he kept painted white, because Marcella had once mentioned, offhandedly and years before, that she had always thought white fences were cheerful, and Thomas Alden had never let a detail like that pass him by. He had built the gate last, and he had fitted it with a heavy iron latch that closed with a satisfying clunk, and on the morning he rode out to help his neighbor Harvey Prout with a cattle dispute that had grown more heated than anyone expected. He had latched it behind him and smiled back at Marcella standing on the porch, and that was the last time she ever saw him alive. The cattle dispute had become a shooting. Thomas had not been the one doing the shooting, and he had not been the one with a grievance, but a bullet does not concern itself much with innocence, and Thomas Alden had come home across the back of a borrowed horse 3 days later, and the white fence had seemed to Marcella on that afternoon like the cruelest joke the world had ever played on her. She had kept the gate latched after that. Not as a conscious decision at first, not as a ritual or a declaration, but simply because it was easier to keep it latched. The latch was heavy and cold and real, and in those first months when everything else felt like it was dissolving around her, the weight of the iron in her hand was one of the few things that felt solid. She latched it when she came in with the eggs. She latched it when she sent her daughter Clara, who was 7 when Thomas died, down the road to the schoolhouse that the town of Harlow had started running out of a repurposed livery stable. She latched it behind every delivery boy and every neighbor woman who came calling with a casserole dish and a sorrowful expression, and she latched it at night with a kind of ferocity that was not entirely about security. After a while, people noticed, and after a longer while, people stopped remarking on it. Marcella was 31 years old in the autumn of 1882. She had dark hair that she wore twisted up and pinned with a carved bone comb that had been her mother's, and brown eyes that people who did not know her sometimes mistook for warm right up until they understood that the warmth had limits and that those limits were enforced. She was not a cold woman. She was a woman who had loved deeply and lost catastrophically, and rebuilt herself out of the wreckage with very few spare parts, and the result was someone who was entirely competent, occasionally funny, deeply loyal to the small number of people she still let anywhere near her, and about as approachable to strangers as a coiled rattlesnake. Her daughter Clara was now 12, old enough to be genuinely useful around the homestead, and young enough to still have an uncomplicated enthusiasm for most things, which Marcella privately considered one of the great mercies of her life. Clara had her father's fair coloring, which was a gift and an ache in equal measure, and she had her mother's stubbornness, which was simply a fact. The homestead produced enough to sustain them. Marcella had added chickens and 2 milk cows to Thomas's original operation, and she had negotiated a contract with the Harlow General Store to supply eggs on a regular basis, and she had taken in mending work during the 2 winters when the crops had been lean. She had done all of this without accepting charity from anyone, which was something she was aware could be characterized either as admirable or as deeply inconvenient depending on who you asked, and she did not particularly care which characterization people preferred. She was mending a harness on the porch on the afternoon of October the 14th when the stranger rode up to her gate. She heard the horse before she saw it, a solid, rhythmic sound on the packed dirt of the road, not hurried, not hesitant, the kind of pace that suggests a rider who is going somewhere and has calculated his time well. She looked up from the harness and saw a man on a gray roan, and her first impression was of broad shoulders and a weathered coat, and a hat that had been good quality about 3 years ago and still retained the ghost of that quality in its shape if not its color. He stopped at the gate and looked at it, and then he looked at her. "Morning," he said, and his voice was the kind that carried without effort, a little rough around the edges in a way that suggested he spent more time outdoors than in. "It is past noon," Marcella said without looking up from the harness. There was a brief pause. "So it is," he agreed, and he sounded more amused than abashed, which she noted. "Afternoon, then." "I am looking for the Prout place. Harvey Prout. I was told it is about 2 miles past a white fence on this road, and I have been riding 3 miles and have not seen another fence, white or otherwise." Marcella set the harness down across her knee and looked at him properly. He was perhaps 35, she estimated, perhaps a year or two either side of that, with a face that was tanned dark and had a jaw that looked like it had been set firmly since about the age of 15, and had never seen a reason to relax. His eyes were gray, which was an unusual color in a man, she thought, not blue-gray but true gray, like the sky in January. He had a bedroll and saddlebags and a rifle in a scabbard, and he wore a duster that was road dusty but not filthy, and his horse was well tended, which she always considered more revealing than any other observable fact about a person. "The Prout place is behind you," she said. "You rode past it. The fence is half collapsed on the east side, and Harvey has not gotten around to painting what remains of it in about 4 years, so it is not what you would call prominently white anymore." He turned in his saddle and looked back down the road with an expression that suggested he was recalibrating several things simultaneously. "Well," he said. "It happens," she said. He turned back to her. His gray eyes moved over the gate and then up to her face with a frankness that was not rude but was entirely direct. "I appreciate the correction. I am Oscar Sutton." She held his gaze for a moment. "Marcella Alden. Mrs. Alden. That is right." He touched the brim of his hat with 2 fingers, a small, clean gesture, and she found herself watching it without intending to. "Thank you for your help," he said, and then he turned his horse and rode back the way he had come at the same unhurried pace, and she watched him go for longer than she meant to before she picked up the harness again. She did not think about him for the rest of the afternoon, except that she did, in the way that you do not think about a thing you are actively deciding not to think about. Harvey Prout's place had indeed gone to considerable disrepair in the 5 years since Thomas's death. Harvey was older and had never fully recovered from what people in Harlow described with careful vagueness as the incident, which was the same incident that had left Marcella a widow and had left Harvey carrying a bullet in his left shoulder, and a weight on his conscience that he never spoke about directly but that showed in the deep lines around his mouth, and the way he could not quite meet Marcella's eyes when they passed each other in town. Harvey was not a bad man. He was a man who had made a bad decision and had been trying to outwork the consequences ever since, and at 62 he was running out of time and energy to do it. Oscar Sutton, as it emerged over the following days through the particular efficient gossip network of a small frontier town, was Harvey's nephew from Kansas. He had come to help his uncle with the place, which needed considerably more help than one man could reasonably provide, and he was planning to stay through the winter at minimum. Marcella heard this from Dorothea Crane, who ran the general store with her husband Walt, and who considered the circulation of information to be both a professional and a personal responsibility. Dorothea mentioned it on a Wednesday when Marcella brought her egg delivery, and she mentioned it with the specific tone and particular eye contact that indicated she had formed opinions about the situation and was making them available. "He came into the store yesterday," Dorothea said, wrapping the coin for the eggs in deliberate, slow movements. "Very polite. Bought a full set of provisions, not just the bare minimum either. A man who buys good food is a man who intends to stay, in my experience." "That is a very specific theory," Marcella said. "He asked after you as a matter of fact." Marcella looked up from the counter where she had been examining a spool of thread. "Did he?" Asked who the woman was at the white fence place, what her situation was. Dorothea set the coin down with emphasis. "I told him you were widowed, that you had a daughter, and that you had more competence in one hand than most people had in their entire persons. I also told him you were not, as a general rule, inclined toward conversation with strangers." "Thank you, Dorothea. I did not say it as a discouragement." "I know you did not," Marcella said, and she took her coin and her thread and left before Dorothea could refine her approach. She thought about it on the ride home. The buckboard wheels rattled over the road, and the two mares pulled with their customary steady indifference, and the afternoon light came down through the cottonwoods at a low golden angle that made everything look more significant than it was. She thought about gray eyes and a clean gesture with 2 fingers and a horse that was well cared for, and then she thought about Thomas's face in the morning light and the sound of the iron latch, and she pushed the whole thing away with a firmness that left a faint ache in its wake. When she pulled up to her gate, she got down from the buckboard and unlatched it and led the mares through and latched it again behind her. The latch closed with its familiar weight, and she stood there with her hand on it for a moment, feeling the cold iron, and then she went about the rest of the day. It was 4 days later that Oscar Sutton came by again, and this time he did not stop at the gate by accident. She was in the kitchen garden, turning the soil for winter, when she heard the horse. She stood up and shaded her eyes and watched him ride toward the gate and stop, and she walked over from the garden with her hands still dirty and stood on the inside of the fence and looked at him. He had the same unhurried quality about him. He sat his horse easily, weight settled into the saddle the way a man sits when he has been riding most of his life and stopped noticing it was something he was doing. He held his hat in his hand, which meant he had taken it off before approaching, which was a detail she registered. "Mrs. Alden," he said. "Mr. Sutton. I wanted to come and thank you properly for the other day. I would have been riding back and forth on that road past nightfall without your help." "It did not cost me anything," she said. Even so, he looked at her steadily. "My uncle speaks well of you. He says you are the best neighbor on this road, and he knows he does not deserve that designation." She felt something shift very slightly in her chest, and she pressed it flat before it could become anything. "Your uncle and I have an understanding," she said carefully. "He told me that too." Oscar Sutton looked down at his hat for a moment and then back up at her. "He told me about Thomas. I am sorry for what happened. I want you to know I said as much to my uncle, and that he knows it needs saying more directly than he has managed." She had not been expecting that, and the unexpectedness of it made her throat tighten in a way she had not felt in quite that particular form in a long time. She looked at him and could not immediately determine whether she was grateful or furious or some compound of both that did not have a clean name. "That is between Harvey and me," she said at last. "You are right, I should not have said it." "No," she said. "Actually, I think you should. I think it needed saying. I just did not expect it from you." He looked at her for a long moment. "Would you mind if I came around again sometime, not to cause any trouble? My uncle's place has a fence that needs mending, and he does not have the cedar posts for it. I noticed you have some stacked beside your barn. I am wondering if you would be willing to sell a dozen of them." It was so ordinary, so entirely practical that she nearly laughed and did not. "Come by on Friday," she said. "I will see what I can spare." She watched him ride away again, and this time she did not watch for as long. Progress, she told herself. Of a kind. Clara was the one who first said anything directly. Clara came home from school on Thursday with a look on her face that Marcella had learned to read the way she read whether There was a front moving in, and it was going to say something. Clara sat down at the kitchen table and pulled off her boots and arranged them with the specific care that meant she was thinking about something else entirely. And then she said, quite casually, "Alina Prout said her cousin is fixing up the east pasture fence." "Harvey's place does need a lot of work," Marcella said, without turning from the stove. "Alina said he is very capable. She said he rebuilt a whole barn roof in 3 days in Kansas." "Is that right?" "She said he was married before, but his wife died of fever about 4 years back." Marcella turned from the stove. Clara was looking at her boots with a tremendous apparent interest in their lace configuration. "Alina Prout appears to know a great deal about her cousin," Marcella said. "Alina talks a lot," Clara agreed. Then, looking up, "He sounds like he is a good person, Mama." Marcella looked at her daughter, this 12-year-old girl who had her father's eyes and her mother's directness, and she felt a complicated rush of love and something much harder to categorize. "Most people sound like good people from a distance," she said. "You told me that not everybody does," Clara said. "You told me some people you can tell right away. That Papa was like that." It was the most Clara had ever pushed this particular subject, and Marcella recognized that this was not carelessness but something deliberate, something her daughter had thought about and chosen. She set the wooden spoon down on the stove's edge and turned fully around and sat down across from Clara at the table. "I know," she said, "and that is true. So maybe sometimes people are good from the start," Clara said, with the implacable logic of a 12-year-old making a case. Marcella reached across and tucked a strand of hair behind her daughter's ear. "Maybe sometimes they are," she said. Clara nodded with great seriousness, as though this settled something, and then asked what was for supper, and the conversation moved on, but it did not move away. It settled somewhere in Marcella, somewhere low and quiet and persistent. Oscar came on Friday as agreed. He tied his horse outside the fence and came through the gate that Marcella opened for him, and she led him around to the barn where the cedar posts were stacked. He looked them over with a practiced eye, testing the wood with his thumb and checking the ends for rot, and he chose 14 with the efficiency of a man who knows what he is looking at. "I can give you 12, she said. "2 of those are spoken for." "12 is exactly what I need," he said. He named a fair price, better than fair actually, and she almost argued out of habit before she stopped herself. They loaded the posts into the back of the small wagon he had brought, and he did most of the lifting with a quiet competence that she found herself watching, not in any charged way, just the simple satisfaction of watching someone who is good at a physical task doing it well. When the last post was loaded, he dusted his hands off on his trousers and turned to her. "I noticed your south fence post is listing," he said. "The third one from the gate. It will not last through a hard winter." She had noticed it too and had been meaning to deal with it for 2 weeks. "I know," she said. "I could set it right before I go. Would not take 20 minutes. She looked at him. He was not offering with any particular maneuvering in his expression, just straightforwardly offering, the way a person offers to help when they have noticed something that needs doing and have the capacity to do it. It was such a clean, uncomplicated thing that she was caught off guard by it. "All right," she said. "Thank you." He reset the post while she went back to the kitchen garden, and when he was done he came to find her to let her know, and she thanked him again, and he said it was no trouble, and then he stood there for a moment in the afternoon light, and there was a quality to the pause that was not exactly awkward but was something else, some kind of mutual acknowledgement that neither of them named. "I will likely be needing more posts in the spring," he said finally. "I will likely have them," she said. He nodded and put his hat back on and went to his wagon. She walked with him to the gate and opened it for him, and he drove through, and she stood at the gate with her hand on the latch. "Mrs. Alden," he said, turning in the wagon seat to look at her. "Mr. Sutton, thank you for the posts and the conversation." "The conversation was not much," she said. "No," he said, "but I enjoyed it." She watched the wagon go, and she stood at the open gate with her hand resting on the latch, not closing it, feeling the cold air come down off the desert ridgeline and the quality of the light which was turning. She stood there longer than she should have with her hand on the unlatched gate, and then she latched it and went inside, and she sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that she did not drink, and she thought for a long time about nothing in particular. November came in hard that year, with a cold snap that frosted the desert floor and brought the mesquite and creosote into a kind of brittle, crystalline beauty that looked impossibly delicate and was in fact extremely durable. The mornings were sharp and thin, and the evenings came down fast. Marcella's days had their established rhythms, and she kept to them with the discipline that had carried her through the past 5 years. She milked the cows at first light. She fed the chickens. She made breakfast for herself and Clara. She did whatever the homestead required, which was always something, and in the evenings she mended or read or sat by the fire with Clara and listened to her daughter talk about the schoolhouse and Eleanor Prout and the various social dramas of a 12-year-old's world, which were as real and as consequential to Clara as anything else. Oscar Sutton came by 3 more times in November, each time with a legitimate purpose. Once for more nails, of which Marcella had a surplus. Once to return a tool he had borrowed from Thomas's collection. Harvey had found it in his barn and recognized it, and sent it back with Oscar, which was another gesture that made Marcella sit with complicated feelings for a while. And once simply because he had been passing on his way back from town, and the Prout fence on the north side was adjacent to the Alden fence, and he had noticed a section of her fence that looked like it had taken some damage from a deer crossing. Each time he came through the gate she opened for him, and each time he left she stood at the gate afterward with her hand on the latch and the gate still open, and each time she stood there a little longer than the time before. She was not naive about what this meant. She was 31 years old and she had been in love before, deeply and completely, and she knew the preliminary landscape of it the way you know the early signs of weather. She knew the way a specific person begins to occupy a particular space in your thinking that is not quite the same as other people, the way your attention goes to certain things, a well-tended horse, the clean gesture of 2 fingers on a hat brim, the way someone sets a fence post with the same care they would take with anything worth doing properly. She was not naive, but she was also genuinely terrified, and she did not think those 2 states were contradictory. Dorothea Crane had more to say on the subject, which was inevitable. "He is in here almost every week," Dorothea said on a gray November afternoon when Marcella came for thread and coffee. Buying supplies, asking questions about the territory, sensible questions. He asked Walt about water rights, and Walt said he answered better than most men who have lived here for 20 years. "Harvey Prout's water situation is complicated," Marcella said. "He asked about you," Dorothea said, with the air of someone producing a significant document. Marcella kept her eyes on the thread display. "Dorothea," he asked very carefully. "He asked whether you were managing all right, whether you had reliable help for the heavy work, whether there was anything the neighbors could do that you had not yet been approached about. He did not ask it in a nosy way. He asked it the way a person asks when they are genuinely wondering and trying to determine the appropriate way to be useful." Marcella turned from the thread display and looked at Dorothea directly. Dorothea looked back with an expression that was a very refined combination of affection and information and the smallest amount of strategic pressure. "I know what you are doing," Marcella said. "I am reporting what I observed," Dorothea said, entirely without shame. "What you do with that information is your own business. It always has been." Marcella bought her thread and her coffee, and she rode home through the cold afternoon, and she thought about a man asking careful, genuinely concerned questions about a woman he had known for 6 weeks, and she thought about what Thomas would have made of that, and she found that she could answer that question clearly. Thomas, who had never met a person he did not try to understand, who had always valued the particular quality of careful attention in others. Thomas would have liked Oscar Sutton. She was as certain of that as she was of anything, and the certainty was not a grief exactly. It was more like a door that had been closed swinging slightly, just slightly, open. She told Clara that Oscar Sutton seemed like a decent man. Clara, doing her sums at the kitchen table, looked up and said, "I know. Eleanor told me about the barn roof again." "She has told you about it several times," Marcella said. "She is very proud of her cousin," Clara said, and went back to her sums. The event that changed things was a practical one, and it happened on the second Tuesday of December. Marcella had been up since before dawn with one of her milk cows, who was having a difficult time with what turned out to be a minor infection that nevertheless required attention and patience, and a cold 2 hours in the barn with a lantern and a poultice and hands that were numb by the end of it. She got the cow settled and went back to the house and found that the kitchen fire had gone fully out while she was away, and that the firewood box was empty, and that it was, according to her best estimate, somewhere around 20 degrees outside. She wrapped herself in her heaviest coat and went out to the woodpile, and found that the woodpile had the particular quality of being considerably less than she had estimated it was. Not empty, but not adequate for the kind of cold that December in the Arizona high desert could deliver, and this winter had been telegraphing its intentions clearly. She had meant to get more split, and she had been putting it off because she was tired, and she was standing in the cold gray dawn looking at an insufficient woodpile, and realizing that tired was not a good enough reason. She was in the process of calculating what she could do about this before Clara needed to leave for school when she heard a horse and looked up to see Oscar Sutton riding up the road with his collar turned up against the cold. He pulled up at the gate and looked at her, and he looked at the woodpile she was looking at, and his expression was entirely readable. "I have 3 cords of split wood at my uncle's place," he said. "Split it myself last month. You are welcome to half of it." "I cannot take half your wood," she said. "I split it to sell, not to keep. Was going to bring it around to folks who need it." He looked at her steadily. "You need it." She started to say something and stopped. The cold was settling into her fingers, and she had been awake for several hours already, and the cow still needed checking, and Clara would be up soon wanting breakfast, and she was tired, genuinely tired, in the way that a person gets when they have been doing everything alone for 5 years, and the weight of it occasionally asserts itself in moments exactly like this one. "All right," she said, and her voice came out less steady than she intended. "Thank you. What do you want for it?" "I want to bring it to you this afternoon," he said. "We can work out the price after." She nodded. He held her gaze for a moment with those gray eyes, and there was something in his expression that was not pity. She had seen enough pity to know its texture, but something more like recognition, as though he understood the specific character of this kind of exhaustion. He brought the wood that afternoon with a full wagon load, and he and Marcella stacked it together against the south wall of the house where it would stay driest. And Clara, who had been watching from the window with a studied nonchalance that convinced no one, eventually came out and helped stack the smaller pieces, and Oscar spoke to her with the same directness he used with adults, which Clara clearly appreciated. "You are good at this," Oscar told Clara, watching her stack a row with clean, tight precision. "Mama showed me how," Clara said with considerable pride. Oscar looked at Marcella. "Good teacher," he said. "It was a small thing. It was a very small thing, and she knew it was a small thing, and yet it went through her with a warmth that was completely out of proportion to its size, and she kept stacking wood and did not look at him for a little while. They had coffee after, because it would have been rude not to offer, and she was not, even at her most defended, impolite without cause. He sat at her kitchen table with his coat off and his hat on the hook by the door, and he drank the coffee, and he did not fill the silence with unnecessary words, which was something she noticed. He did not feel compelled to talk, and she appreciated this more than almost anything, because most people who came into her house in any neighborly capacity filled every available silence with words, as though the silence itself were something to be managed. She told him about the cow and the infection, and he asked the right questions, and it turned out he had some experience with cattle ailments from the Kansas years, and they talked about it in a practical, comfortable way, and somewhere in the middle of the conversation, she realized that she was simply talking to someone, simply having an ordinary conversation, and that it felt good, and that she had missed it. She had missed the particular feeling of talking to someone who was genuinely listening, who was asking the next question because they wanted to know the answer, and not because they were filling time. Clara had gone to her room to read, and the kitchen was quiet except for the fire and the wind against the windows, and when the coffee was gone and there was a natural pause, Oscar Sutton put both hands flat on the table and looked at her. "Mrs. Alden," he said, and then he stopped. "You might as well call me Marcella," she said, "given that you have now been in my barn, my woodpile, and my kitchen." Something shifted very slightly in his face. Not a smile exactly, but the precondition for one. "Marcella," he said, and her name in his voice was different from the way it sounded in her own head. "I would like to come and see you, not for fences or wood or any other practical purpose. Just to see you. I want to be straightforward about that so you can tell me plainly whether it is something you are willing to consider." She looked at him for a long moment. The fire made a small settling sound. Outside, the wind pushed against the house. "I appreciate the directness," she said. "I thought you might." I have not done this in a long time," she said. "I need you to understand that. I am not a person who comes to things quickly." "I am not asking you to come quickly," he said. "I am asking if I can come and sit with you sometimes and talk. That is all I am asking for right now." She considered him. She considered the 5 years and the iron latch and the specific quality of the loneliness she carried, which was not the same as unhappiness but was its own particular weight. She considered what she had said to Clara about people you can tell right away. "Sunday afternoons," she said. "After church. You can come for coffee." His expression, the full expression that had been hovering just under the surface of his face for weeks, came forward in a way that was quiet but entirely genuine. "Sunday afternoons," he said, "after church. And if Clara does not take to you, that will be the end of it," she said, because she needed him to know that clearly. "That is entirely fair," he said. He came on Sunday. He came the Sunday after that. He came every Sunday through December and into January. They talked about everything and nothing with the particular ease that develops between two people who have both been alone for a while and have accumulated things they did not realize they wanted to say until someone was there to say them too. He told her about Kansas, about the farm he had worked with his late wife, about the particular way grief can make the familiar feel foreign, and how he had eventually sold the Kansas property because he could not walk through the rooms without feeling like a trespasser in his own life. She told him about Thomas, carefully at first and then less carefully. She told him about the fence and the latch and why she had started keeping the gate closed, and she watched his face as she said it, and what she saw there was neither uncomfortable nor pitying but simply present, simply attentive. "The latch is like keeping something," he said. "Not him exactly, but the shape of the life." She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said, "that is exactly right." Clara had opinions as agreed. She expressed them in her characteristically direct fashion, which was largely through the medium of questions. She asked Oscar Sutton whether he liked horses better than cattle, whether he thought the schoolhouse in Harlow should teach Latin in addition to arithmetic, whether he had ever seen a rattlesnake up close, and whether he thought the government's treatment of the Apache people in the territory was something that should be discussed or something that people preferred not to mention. This last question, which was the most pointed, had come from a conversation Marcella had had with Clara about the territory's history and the injustices of the reservation system, and Marcella had been genuinely curious how Oscar would handle it. He had looked at Clara with complete seriousness. "It should be discussed," he said. "What has been done to the peoples of this land is a wrong that does not get smaller because people prefer not to see it, and I think children who ask that question are better citizens than most adults I know." Clara had considered this answer for a long time, and then she had gone back to her supper, And the following Sunday she had told Oscar he could sit in her father's chair if he wanted because it was the most comfortable one. Marcella had had to look at the kitchen wall for a moment after that, and Oscar had looked at the kitchen wall too, and when they both looked back, they did not need to say anything about it. January turned to February, and the desert winter softened by degrees, the way it does, with sudden warm days that smelled like something coming and cold nights that reminded you not to be foolish about it. The work on the Prout place had made significant progress, and the homestead looked genuinely improved, and Harvey Prout had stopped avoiding Marcella's eyes entirely, which was its own slow-moving process. Oscar and Harvey had had conversations that Oscar never reported to Marcella directly, but that she inferred from the changes in Harvey's demeanor. Whatever had been said in those conversations had moved something, and one Sunday in late February, Harvey himself appeared at her gate, hat in hand, and asked if he might come in for a minute. She let him in. He sat in the kitchen and he told her what he had needed to tell her for 5 years, and it was awkward and imperfect, and he cried once, which she had not expected from Harvey Prout, and she cried once herself, and at the end of it she put her hand across the table and put it over his old, rough hand and said, "I am glad you came." He left, walking slow back to the gate, and she latched it after him and leaned her forehead against the fence post and breathed through the particular feeling of something breaking loose that had been compacted for a very long time. Oscar had not been there for that meeting and she had not told him it was going to happen. But that Sunday, when he came for coffee, he sat down across from her and looked at her face and said, very quietly, "He came." "He came," she said. Oscar nodded slowly. "Good," he said. "He said you told him he needed to," she said. "I told him nothing he did not already know," Oscar said. She looked at him across the kitchen table and felt something she had not felt in 5 years. Something that was neither the ghost of what she had lost nor a replacement for it, but its own separate, new, real thing. And it was enormous and quiet at the same time, the way truly significant things often are when they arrive. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and neither of them said anything. And the fire made its sounds, and outside the desert afternoon was bright and cold and perfectly ordinary. And she thought, this is it. This is how it starts again. Not in a blaze, but in a kitchen on a Sunday afternoon with 2 cups of coffee going cold. March brought the spring work, and the spring work brought them into each other's orbit in the natural way of neighboring homesteads, where there is always something that benefits from 2 pairs of hands. Oscar helped her replace the section of fence that had been damaged in a December windstorm. She helped him with the accounts for the Prout operation, which had become considerably more complex as the improvements progressed. Clara accompanied her mother on several of these occasions and was full of opinions about everything, and gradually, visibly, impossibly, began to treat Oscar Sutton with the casual proprietorial affection that a young person shows toward an adult they have decided is theirs to have opinions about. One afternoon in mid-March, Oscar came by to help Marcella sort the new seed order she had received from the catalog, and they sat at the kitchen table going through the packets, and he was quiet for a while, and then he said, "May I tell you something?" "You generally do not ask permission," she said, which was true. "This one I am asking for," he said. She looked up from a packet of squash seed. "All right. I am not a man who says things he does not mean," he said, "and I want you to know that first." He was looking at the table at the spread of seed packets, and then he looked up at her. "I have been coming here since October, and every time I come I do not want to leave. And when I am not here I am thinking about being here. And I know that I know the weight of what you have been through, and I am not asking for anything right now except that you know that I love you. Not as a demand, not as a pressure. I needed you to know it, that is all." She looked at him for a long time. The afternoon light came through the kitchen window and lay across the table between them and across the seed packets with their bright illustrated covers. "I know," she said softly. "I know you do." "And," he said, and it was the most vulnerable she had heard his voice. "And I have been falling in love with you for months," she said, "which has been terrifying, and I have not entirely made my peace with the terrifying part, but I am working on it." He exhaled in a way that released something considerable. "Terrifying is acceptable," he said. "Good," she said, "because it is what is available." He reached across the seed packets and tucked a strand of her dark hair behind her ear with the same gentleness he used for everything, and she caught his hand before it withdrew and held it against her cheek for a moment, and he let her, and neither of them moved for a little while. April was longer days and shorter temperatures, and the desert coming up in the specific spectacular way it has in spring, when things that looked entirely dead turn out to have been waiting for exactly this. The saguaros put out their crowns of white flowers. The ocotillo blazed orange-red. The morning smelled like warm earth and something floral that she had never been able to name and had always loved. Oscar and Marcella walked together in the evenings when the work was done, along the fence line or out toward the ridge that marked the eastern boundary of her property. And Clara sometimes came with them, and sometimes did not, with the instinctual social intelligence of a 12-year-old who had opinions about how certain situations should develop. On the evenings she did not come, Oscar and Marcella walked and talked and were sometimes quiet together, and the quiet was the kind that fills up rather than empties out. He told her more about Kansas, about his late wife whose name had been Ruth, who had been bright and impatient and had died of a fever in the summer of 1878, and whom he had loved genuinely and mourned genuinely, and had not stopped mourning so much as had reached a point where the mourning was integrated into him rather than consuming him. He spoke about Ruth without difficulty, with the clarity of someone who has done the necessary work of grief, and she appreciated that clarity because it told her where he was, and it was a true place. She told him more about Thomas, the real Thomas, not just the grief but the person, the way he hummed while he worked, the letters he wrote to her mother even after the woman had passed, because he said it helped him think, the particular stubbornness that was the source of both his virtues and his occasional impossible wrong-headedness, the way he had laughed. Oscar listened to all of it and asked questions, and once he said, "He sounds like a man worth grieving properly," and she had felt the truth of that settle in her like a stone settling into clear water. One evening in late April, standing on the ridge with the desert spread out below them going gold and rose in the last light, Oscar turned to her and said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know you can take as much time as you need." "I am not going to need much time," she said. He looked at her. "You do not know what I am going to say." "I have a reasonable estimate," she said. He smiled, the full smile that had been developing incrementally since October, and she thought for perhaps the 100th time how much she liked his face when it did that. He reached into his coat pocket and brought out a ring that was simple and gold and clearly not new, and he held it flat in his palm. "My grandmother's," he said. "She told me to give it to the right one and not the convenient one. I believe she would consider the timing on this appropriate." He looked at her. "Marcella Alden. I would like very much to spend the rest of my life being the person who is nearby when you need two pairs of hands, and the person you talk to in the evenings, and the person Clara tolerates at the dinner table. I would like to be your family. I know what you have already built here. I am not asking you to give any of it up. I am asking if there is room in it for me." She looked at the ring in his palm and at his face, and at the desert behind him going from gold to rose to the first deep purple, and she thought about the gate and the latch and 5 years of iron-cold mornings and the way it felt to stand at the gate with her hand not closing it, the way the open space felt, not frightening, not like loss, but like something that was supposed to be open. "There is room," she said. "There has been room for some time. I just needed to find where I had put it." He put the ring on her finger and she looked at it for a moment, and then she looked at him, and she kissed him there on the ridge with the desert going dark around them and his hands warm on her face, and it was nothing at all like the first time she had been kissed, because nothing is ever the same as anything else that matters, and it was everything. Clara, it emerged, had known about the ring because Oscar had asked her first. He had told Marcella this the morning after, over coffee, looking slightly abashed in a way she found entirely endearing. "You asked my 12-year-old daughter for her permission," Marcella said. "I asked her opinion," he said, "which is different." "And what was her opinion?" "She said I was acceptable and that she wanted to be involved in the wedding planning in a meaningful capacity," he said. Marcella sat with that for a moment. "She said exactly that, meaningful capacity. Those were her exact words." Marcella laughed. It came out full and genuine, and she put her hand over her mouth, and he watched her laugh with an expression she had never seen on his face before, one of complete unguarded happiness, and she thought, this is what it looks like when someone is glad in the way that goes all the way down. They were married in June, in the yard of the Harlow Baptist Church, which was the only church in Harlow, and served adequately for the purpose regardless of anyone's particular theological affiliations. It was a warm, clear day with a sky the specific blue that the Arizona Territory does better than anywhere Marcella had ever been, and the white clouds were high and still, and the ceremony was short and honest and attended by the whole of the small community. Harvey Prout stood for Oscar. Dorothea Crane stood for Marcella, which she did with enormous satisfaction, and a hat that was considerably more festive than the occasion strictly required. Clara wore a new dress that she and Marcella had made together in the evenings of May, a blue calico that Clara had chosen herself, and that set off her fair coloring beautifully. And she stood beside her mother with a seriousness that occasionally broke into pure delight, that she then tried to reassemble into seriousness. The minister asked who gave this woman in marriage, and Clara said, in a clear voice that carried perfectly, "I do," which caused a ripple of laughter through the assembled neighbors and caused Marcella to press her lips together very firmly and look at the sky for a moment. Oscar squeezed her hand and she looked at him, and he was watching her with those gray eyes, and she thought, there is nowhere else I need to be. And the thought was not a forgetting of anything that had come before, but an arrival somewhere new. At the reception, which was held in the yard of the Alden homestead with trestle tables borrowed from the church and food contributed by approximately every woman in Harlow, Oscar danced with Clara first, a terrible solemn two-step that they both performed with great concentration, and then he danced with Marcella, and they were better at it, not because they were practiced, but because they were paying attention to each other, and that is most of what dancing is. "Mrs. Sutton," he said, against her hair. "That will take some getting used to," she said. "Take as long as you need," he said. She laughed again, and he held her closer, and the evening came down over the desert in all its rose and gold extravagance, and the people around them talked and ate, and the children ran between the tables, and the lanterns were lit one by one as the light failed. The summer passed in the way that summers do when you are happy and working, and the work is your own quickly, fully, with a quality of richness that you are aware of even as it happens rather than only in retrospect. Oscar moved into the Alden homestead, which became the Sutton homestead, and the transition was not without its adjustments because two people who have lived alone for any significant period of time have established patterns that require negotiation, and they negotiated with reasonable success, and the occasional friction was settled in the way that friction between people who love each other is settled, which is through conversation and occasional stubbornness from both parties and eventually a resolution that serves them both. Harvey Prout sold the eastern section of his property that autumn and retired to a smaller arrangement in town, which suited him better than the farm work had for some years. He came to dinner at the Sutton homestead on the first Sunday of every month, and he and Oscar played cards after, and Clara beat them both with sufficient regularity that it became a source of considerable household pride. Oscar turned out to be, in the practical daily terms of a shared life, exactly what he had seemed to be from the beginning, which is a thing that can never be entirely taken for granted, and which Marcella found herself genuinely and specifically grateful for. He was steady and competent and genuinely funny in a dry, understated way that surprised people who did not know him and delighted Marcella, who had expected it. He took Clara's school progress seriously and helped with her sums, which were the subject of ongoing difficulty, with a patience that was not indulgent but was real. He learned the rhythms of the homestead and worked them without complaint and with evident satisfaction. He also had opinions, which Marcella had expected and which she welcomed, because a man without opinions is a man who is not fully present, and she had no interest in that. They disagreed about the rotation of the south field, and about whether Clara was old enough to ride to school alone, and about the appropriate degree of hospitality owed to neighbors who arrived at inconvenient times, and they resolved these disagreements through the medium of sustained and occasionally heated discussion, and the resolutions were generally better than either of their initial positions would have been on their own. She found that she was changed by him in ways she had not anticipated. Not fundamentally changed, not altered in her nature, but opened, the way a room is changed by the addition of a window. Same room, same walls, but more light. The gate. She thought about the gate sometimes and what it meant now. She still latched it at night, because there were still coyotes and occasionally less predictable things in the Arizona territory, and because a latched gate is simply a practical thing. But she had stopped feeling the latch as a closing, a sealing off. It was just a gate now. It opened and closed as the day required, and she did not stand over the weight of it the way she once had. In the spring of 1883, she told Oscar that she thought she might be expecting. He was at the workbench in the barn, fitting a new handle to a hoe, and he stopped the work and put the hoe down and turned to look at her with an expression that was so entirely unguarded that she felt it as a physical thing. "Are you sure?" he said. "Not entirely," she said, "but fairly." He came across the barn and put his hands on her face the way he had on the ridge in April a year ago, with that particular quality of attention, and he looked at her for a long moment, and she watched something move through his face that was immense and quiet at the same time. "How do you feel?" he said. "Frightened," she said honestly, "and very glad." "Both of those are right," he said. The baby was a boy. She knew this the way she had known things before, the body's particular knowledge of itself. And when he arrived in November of 1883, a fierce and loud and apparently indignant baby boy, the midwife Mrs. Garrity placed him in Marcella's arms, and she looked at his red, furious, perfect face, and felt the specific enormous love that is different from every other love while being related to all of them. Oscar, who had been outside the bedroom door, was allowed in, and he sat beside her on the bed and looked at the baby, and she watched his face do what faces do in these moments. The way a whole set of emotions move through so quickly that they overlap. "He is very loud," Oscar said softly. "He is," Marcella said. "I think he might have your disposition," Oscar said. "I think he might have yours," she said. "That is a very stubborn chin." They named him Thomas Elias Sutton. Thomas for Thomas Alden, which Oscar had suggested before she had said anything about it, and she had held onto that fact and turned it over for days afterward because of what it meant about him. Elias had been Oscar's father's name, which completed the gesture. Clara received the news of her brother's name with characteristic thoughtfulness. She sat with it for a full dinner before she said, "I think Papa would have liked that," and then she said, "I also think Papa would have liked Oscar," and then she went back to her meal with the air of someone who has said the necessary things. Marcella looked at Oscar across the table. He was looking at Clara with an expression she had come to know well, the expression that was love without sentimentality, clear and direct and real. "He would have," she said. "The homestead grew in the years that followed. Not extravagantly, not in ways that exceeded their means, but steadily, the way good things grow when they are tended. They added a proper milk barn. They expanded the kitchen garden to include a proper orchard section, apples and pears that would take years to fully produce, but that they planted with the patient perspective of people who intend to be somewhere for a long time. Oscar brought in a contract for supplying horses to a remuda operation that was establishing itself in the territory, which was good additional income and suited his skills well. Marcella continued her egg contract with the Crane store and expanded it, and she began teaching Clara the accounts with a rigor that suggested she had plans for that capacity. Thomas grew from a fierce, loud baby to an equally fierce and considerably louder toddler, and then to a boy of 4 who was convinced he could do everything the adults did, and could not yet but was not particularly deterred by this. He had Oscar's gray eyes and Marcella's dark hair, which combination resulted in a face that strangers stopped to remark upon, and he had the stubbornness of both his parents operating at full amplitude, which was magnificent and frequently exhausting. Clara, at 16, was becoming the person Marcella had been watching her become since she was small, serious and quick and funny when she trusted you, and fiercely principled about everything that mattered, which turned out to be a significant list. She had decided she was going to teach, which was a decision she had reached at 14 and had not wavered from, and she was preparing herself accordingly with a thoroughness that made Marcella deeply proud. In the autumn of 1886, there was a second baby. Another boy, as Marcella had suspected, though this one arrived quieter than Thomas had, contemplative, taking in the world with large, dark eyes from the beginning. They named him Franklin, which had been Marcella's father's name, and from the moment he was old enough to be held by his brother, Thomas was devoted to him with a fierce and proprietary love that everyone found both touching and occasionally alarming. Dorothea Crane came to visit and held Franklin and said, with tremendous satisfaction, "I always knew how this was going to go," and Marcella said, "You absolutely did not," and Dorothea said, "I had a very good sense of it." Oscar, carrying Thomas on one hip so he could look at the baby over the edge of the crib, glanced at Marcella, and she looked back at him, and they had the conversation that long married people have without speaking. The one that is something like, "Can you believe any of this?" And the answer is no, and it does not bear examination too closely. And is it not extraordinary? And yes, it is. It absolutely is. The gate. She thought about the gate that autumn, in one of those still moments that fall into the middle of a busy life like a stone into water, small and clear and radiating outward. She was standing at it on an October evening, not for any particular reason, just standing there with the light going down over the desert and the sound of Thomas's voice from somewhere in the barn, and the particular smell of October in the high desert that she would know anywhere in the world. She thought about the morning she had stood here with her hand on the latch and looked at Oscar Sutton sitting on a horse and told him it was past noon. She thought about the months of Sundays and the seed packets on the table and the ring flat in his palm on the ridge. She thought about the first time she had stood here after he left and not latched the gate, just stood with her hand resting on the cold iron and the gate still open, and how that had felt not like recklessness but like recognition, like the land itself acknowledging that something had shifted. She had left the gate unlatched that day, and he had come back, and she had not latched it behind him in the way she had latched everything behind everyone for 5 years, had not sealed the opening, had stood in the space between latched and unlatched, and in that small physical fact something had been decided that she had not consciously decided, but that her body and her hands had understood before her thinking mind had caught up. She put her hand on the gate now, and she did not close it. She stood in the open space of it and looked at the road and the desert and the darkening sky, and then she heard Oscar's voice behind her, coming across the yard from the house. "Supper is ready," he said. "Thomas is threatening to eat your portion if you do not come in." "Thomas is 4 years old," she said without turning. "He threatens a great deal." "He is very convincing," Oscar said. He came up beside her and stood at the gate and looked down the road the way she was looking. "What are you thinking about?" She turned and looked at him. He was 40, she thought, or close to it, and he looked like what he was, a man who had worked hard in the open air for a long time, weathered and capable, and with those gray eyes that were the same as they had been on the road that October afternoon in 1882 when he had called it morning and she had corrected him, and he had sounded more amused than abashed. "The first time you came to this gate," she said. He looked at her steadily. "What about it?" "I am glad you stopped," she said. "I am glad you stopped at the wrong gate by accident, and I am glad you came back." He reached over and put his hand over hers where it rested on the gate post. "So am I," he said. "Every day." "Even the days I am difficult," she said. "Especially those days," he said. "The difficult ones are the most interesting." She laughed, warm and full, and he joined her, and from the house she could hear Thomas's voice rising in apparent urgency about the supper situation, and somewhere Franklin would be waking from his nap, and Clara would be at the table with her books. The whole of the life she had built and lost and rebuilt, and was still building, was inside that house and spilling out into the yard, and the barn and the garden, and up to the ridge line, where the last of the October light was catching the tops of the saguaros in a blaze of rose gold. She latched the gate. She did it without heaviness, the way you latch a gate at the end of a day, the simple practical act of closing what belongs closed. And she took Oscar's hand, and they walked back to the house together in the good dark of an October evening in the Arizona Territory, in the year 1886, on a piece of land that had known grief and silence and the closed weight of iron, and now knew something else entirely. The sound of children's voices and the smell of supper, and two people who had found each other at a white fence on a high desert road, and had not let go since. Inside, Thomas had not eaten her supper, but he had moved it to his side of the table as a demonstration of intent, and Franklin was making the small exploratory sounds of a baby discovering that he has a voice, and Clara looked up from her books and said, "I was about to send a search party," and Oscar sat down and pulled Thomas into his lap and said, "Your mother was philosophizing at the gate," and Marcella sat down and picked up her supper and said, "I was not philosophizing. I was simply standing," and Clara said, "For a woman who was simply standing you took a very long time," and the whole table laughed and the lamp made its steady warm circle, and outside the Arizona night came down, clean and cold and full of stars. The years arranged themselves around this life with the orderliness of good things properly tended. Clara finished her schooling at 18 and secured a position as teacher's assistant at the Harlow schoolhouse, which she improved in 18 months sufficiently that the town council made her the primary teacher and built a proper schoolhouse with real desks and a proper chalkboard. And she was both the youngest teacher in the territory and, by general assessment, one of the best. She was happy and serious, and she came to Sunday dinner without fail, and she and Oscar still played cards with Thomas when he was old enough, and Thomas still beat them both. Thomas, at 7, was a force of nature. He could ride before he could reliably read, which was a source of mild, ongoing concern, and he had opinions about horses that were more sophisticated than his opinions about arithmetic, which was itself a source of ongoing educational effort. He was ferociously affectionate with Franklin, and had appointed himself his brother's protector in a comprehensive and often unnecessary way, and he called Oscar Papa with the casual ease of a child who has never known anything different, and Oscar called him Trouble with the equal ease of a man who is entirely and obviously delighted by the trouble in question. Franklin was quieter than his brother in all ways, and had the particular quality of very careful attention to the world around him, watching things with those large dark eyes, and then periodically producing observations that were so accurate and well-formed that the adults at the table would stop and look at each other. He was 4 when he said, during a thunderstorm that had Thomas claiming bravery he was not entirely demonstrating, "The lightning is looking for the highest thing. That is why we must be the smallest." Oscar had looked at Marcella and Marcella had looked at Oscar, and neither of them had known exactly what to say, and Clara, who was there for supper, had said, "Frank, I think you might be a scientist," and Franklin had considered this and said, "Or a weather man," which everyone had felt was a reasonable alternative. In the spring of 1889, Oscar came in from the south pasture with the specific careful face he wore when he had something to say that he was thinking about how to say. "The Fowler property is going up for sale," he said. The Fowler property was the 40 acres immediately to the east of their own, bordering the ridge, with good water access and land that Marcella had been watching for years with the speculative eye of someone who knows good ground when she sees it. "Is it?" she said. "I thought you might want to know," he said. "I have been thinking about the apple orchard," she said. "If we had those 40 acres, the yield projections become considerably more viable." "That is exactly what I have been thinking," he said. "We would need to look at what we can manage financially," she said. "I have been looking at that too," he said. "I think we can." She looked at him across the kitchen table where they were having this conversation, which was the same kitchen table where she had once sat with a cup of coffee. She had not drunk and thought about a gray-eyed man who had told her he had enjoyed the conversation. She looked at the room she had lived in through grief and through survival, and through the slow, impossible rebuilding of a life into something new, and she felt a quality of rightness that was so complete and so steady that it did not announce itself. "All right," she said. "Let us buy the Fowler property." They did. They signed the papers in the late summer of 1889, the two of them sitting side by side at a desk in the land office in Tucson, and on the way home with the deed in the inner pocket of Oscar's coat, they stopped the wagon at the top of the ridge and looked at their land, both the original Alden 40 and the new Fowler 40 spreading out below them in the afternoon light, and Oscar put his arm around her and she leaned into him and they looked at it together. "That is a lot of apples," she said. "That is a great many apples," he agreed. "We may need to expand the kitchen garden to accommodate the preserving. Clara can help in the summers. Clara teaches school in the summers." "Clara will make time for apples," Marcella said, with confidence, and she was right. The apple orchard was planted that fall, row upon row of young trees that stood in the desert air like small, improbable declarations of intent. They would not produce in any meaningful quantity for 3 years, and they both knew this and planted them anyway. The way you plant things when you are not simply surviving but genuinely living in a place. When you are putting down the specific roots that mean I expect to be here for all of this. In the autumn of 1890, Marcella turned 40 and Oscar turned, as nearly as he could determine, 41, and the homestead held 80 acres and a white fence, and an orchard that had begun, tentatively, to produce, and an adobe house that had been added to twice, and had thick warm walls and a kitchen that smelled like bread and coffee and sometimes apples. It held 2 boys, Thomas at 9, ferocious and devoted, and Franklin at 7, quiet and precise, and a young woman who came to Sunday dinner and made everyone at the table more interesting. It held a man who had ridden up to a gate by accident and come back on purpose and had been coming back ever since. On the morning of her birthday, Marcella walked out to the gate alone, before the household was fully awake, in the early October cold that smelled like all the Octobers before it. She opened the gate and stood in it, one hand on the post, looking down the road in both directions in the clear first light. She thought about Thomas Alden, as she still did, with a love that was complete and settled and real, a love that had been interrupted rather than resolved, and that lived in her as what she had been given to keep. She thought about the latch and the 5 years, and the weight of iron in the mornings. She thought about the morning a man had ridden up to her gate and called it morning, and she had told him it was past noon. Behind her she heard the door of the house open, and then Oscar's step on the porch, and then the particular sound of his boots on the path, unhurried, easy, coming to find her the way he always came to find her, without announcement and without urgency, simply present. He came through the open gate and stood beside her and looked down the road. "It is a good morning," he said. "It is a very good morning," she said. He put his arm around her, and she turned slightly into his warmth, and they stood together in the open gate in the early light, and the desert was wide and gold before them, and the sky was enormous and blue, And behind them in the house the boys would be waking, and Clara would likely be arriving before long with something she had made and a point she needed to make. And the coffee was on, and the apples in the orchard were ripe. And all of it, every bit of it, was hers. She reached over and with one hand, easily, without weight or grief or the old cold ritual of it, simply latched the gate, not because she was closing anything. Because there was nothing left to keep out and everything she needed was already inside, and the latch was just a latch, and the gate was just a gate, and the morning was magnificent and entirely, completely, perfectly ordinary. "Happy birthday," Oscar said. "Thank you," she said, and took his hand, and they walked back up to the house in the October light where the coffee was on, and the children were waking, and the long, good, ordinary day was beginning.